Daniel 3. We'll read through the chapter in parts. We're going to look at the whole chapter tonight, but we won't read the whole thing right now. But Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together into the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and language, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and you worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, the languages, they fell down and they worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Wherefore at that same time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. And they spake and they said unto the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worship it, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And we'll pause right there. We'll come back here to the text here in just a moment. And so, obviously, Nebuchadnezzar here, he decides to make this image. And just from a historical standpoint, we have found certain images like these, certain statues and things that kind of fit the description of what we read here in Daniel chapter 3. But he makes this image, and it is large. It was a 9 foot wide, but it was a 90 foot tall golden image. And the insinuation is, whereas we never are told specifically, but the insinuation is that it was an image of himself. All right, one way or another, it represented him, but nevertheless, the insinuation is it probably looked like him as well. But he sets up this golden image, 90 foot tall, and we're never told why he did it, but I think the obvious implication is this is following directly on the heels of Nebuchadnezzar being told about the dream that he had, and Daniel saying, "You are the head of gold," right? And so Nebuchadnezzar, as we talked about last week, he would have been thrilled to have been told that he was the head of gold, even though, he was told in no uncertain terms, your kingdom will not last. But nevertheless, he really grabbed hold of the fact that he was that head of gold in this image. And so he makes a whole image of gold, and he makes it of himself, and he calls people to worship it. And so even though we're never specifically told this is why he did it, I don't think we have to search very hard to figure out why he did it. And so he calls together all the leaders of the whole nation, and you see all the categories that are given. Nobody was left out of this. He calls everybody who had some kind of leadership position. And they all come down to the dedication of this image, and the herald begins to cry out, and he tells them, at the sound of music, everybody must fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, for the most part, we see there, after they're told, in verse 7, it says, therefore, at that time when all the people heard the sound of the music, it says that they fell down and they worshiped the golden image. And so, by and large, the people of Babylon did not care. This was par for the course. Again, they were pagans. They serve multiple gods. They have all these various idols that they already worship. To them, it doesn't really matter. If we gain another idol and begin to worship it, it's just one of many. It doesn't really matter to them. However, obviously for the Jews, this created a very certain problem. Even in the midst of captivity, even having been taken from their homeland and thrust into the system of the Babylonians and the Chaldeans, they're still having an opposition to the pagan system. And so their monotheism, I guess you could say, their monotheism is causing consternation with this new decree from King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what is interesting is to look ahead just a little bit. I would imagine, even though in the text we're only told of 3, I would imagine that this was by and large a decree that was met with a lot of problems by many, many Jewish people, not just the 3 that are listed. But I'll talk about that in just a second. So it says certain Chaldeans, they come to Nebuchadnezzar. We're never given their names. We're never told who they were. All it just says is certain Chaldeans. They come to Nebuchadnezzar and they tell him of these Jews who are abstaining, and they name Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they tell him, they said, these men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so this seems to be, I don't even think I have to say seems to be. I think it's quite obvious that this was a ploy, that this was a politically motivated move on the part of these Chaldeans. Undoubtedly, as I just said, undoubtedly, these were not the only 3 who abstained. I think we can very, very safely assume that even if no other Jew abstained, Daniel most certainly did. Now, I did see some commentators and things that suggested that Daniel, because of his high and lofty position, might have been immune from the king's decree, that it wouldn't have applied to him. And whereas that's possible, again, just going by what the text tells us, we're not told that Daniel gets a pass. And so the assumption then, just based on Daniel 3, if we're not reading outside sources, just based on Daniel 3, it would certainly seem to suggest that he would also be under the decree of the king. Again, I feel very safe in saying that Daniel also abstained from this, and he did not fall down, and he did not worship this image. So by that fact, that only these 3 men are named should show us their motivation. This is it's just like when the decree gets signed for everybody to pray to honor the king, and Daniel abstains. We're specifically told there that it was politically motivated. But this is the same sort of situation. Whereas these certain Chaldeans, again, we don't get their name, these certain Chaldeans didn't, as far as we know, come up with the idea to make the golden image. They saw an opportunity to take down the Jews who had been placed in positions of authority, probably over them, and they didn't like that. And so they're trying to use this as a politically motivated means to break them down, which opens up, doorways for promotion for others, right? And so this very much so is a politically motivated move. And I do want to say this before moving on. It should also be noted that the only way this particular accusation could have been made is for these 3 and anybody who is abstaining from this to publicly live out their faith. If they were not publicly living out their faith, they would not have known that they were abstaining from worshiping the image. And so you think about it, if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if they were there at the dedication, they heard the music, all they had to do was just fall down. They didn't have to actually worship it. They didn't have to pray to it. They didn't have to, if they just went through the motions, nobody would have been none the wiser. However, they refused to do anything that would even give the impression that they worshipped another god other than Yahweh. And so there was no way that they were going to do this, because they were dedicated, not only dedicated to worshiping their God, but dedicated to his glory. They would not do anything to take glory away from God and give it to any other. And so they were publicly living out their faith. And I like what Feinberg said. He said, in situations like this, no crime is greater than nonconformity. Yet that is exactly what God asks of us when the things of the world are arrayed against the things of God. And so what becomes clear, and how this is applicable to us, is there are going to be times, and it happens from time to time, where governments or whoever is in authority over us, they make certain laws that are simply not biblical. What we as Christians do not have to do is to go pray and say, God, it's going to be really difficult if I go against this law. So should I just kind of pretend to go with the grain? Should I make it look like I'm agreeing with the government, but in actuality, I'm just going to be serving you? No. If there's something that goes against the law of God, we don't have to question it. We don't do it. We follow God, not man. And so these 3 men, again, assuming there are others, but obviously we're keying in on these 3. These 3 knew we're not praying to any other God. We're not worshiping any other God. We're not even going to give the impression that we're worshiping any other God. And so it was never even a question for them. As soon as Nebuchadnezzar gave the decree, they knew that this was something that they were going to go against, that they were going to oppose this. And so we stopped reading there in verse 12. So picking up in verse 13, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then they were brought, then they brought these three men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar spake unto them. He said, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? He says, Now if you be, I'll deliver you out of my hands. Now, let me just pause here for a second. At the end of chapter 2, the very last verse of chapter 2, it says, Daniel requested of the king, and he set up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And so the king's aware of these men already. It probably should have come as no surprise to him, given Daniel's history. Also, the history of these three. They were the ones who abstained from the king's meat. They have been, you could say, kind of going against the grain for a while. So he probably wasn't all that surprised when he found out these were the guys abstaining from this. And I think we can kind of get a sense of that because the command was clear. If you don't do this, you're cast through the furnace. And yet here, Nebuchadnezzar is trying to give them an opportunity. He's trying to give them a chance to recant, to go back on this. Just, you can almost see him pleading with them, just do it so I don't have to throw you in the furnace. Right? I don't want to have to do this, but my word's been given. And so he gives them a second chance, which I find very fascinating. But he asks this all-important question. He says, who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? And so it says in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered, and they said unto the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so the king's furious. I mean, that's obvious. And so he has them brought in for questioning. And after asking, right, who is the God that can do it? And by his question, he's assuming a negative answer. By that, he's saying, who's the God that can do this? In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he's thinking, there is not a God who can do this. His assumption is a negative answer. He did not expect a positive answer. And so they respond, we are not careful. And by that, they basically mean, we don't need to answer you. That's what that phrase means. We're not careful to answer you. We have no need to answer you. Why do they have no need? Because they basically say, God's going to do it for us. We don't have to answer. God's going to make clear that he is the God who can do this. And so if he throws them in the furnace, they're confident that not only is God able to deliver them, but that he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. And again, there's a big difference between being able to do something and actually doing it. And so Nebuchadnezzar, again, he asked, what God could deliver you? And so they throw down the gauntlet and they say, not only can our God, but our God will deliver us. However, and I want you to see verse 18, because verse 18 is probably, in my mind, the key of the chapter. And so verse 18, it says, But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so they're quick to point this out. And so what they say is, we believe that God can. In fact, we know that God can. We believe that God will. But if we're wrong on what God's will is at this particular point, we will still not worship you. We will still not worship your gods. Essentially what they're saying is God will still get our praise. And so they understand what most don't. And I love this verse. I love the fact that it's in this chapter. Here's what they understand, that God is worthy of our praise even when he doesn't save us from the fire. Obviously, people give him the praise when the three are walking around unharmed. But even when he doesn't pull us out of the fire, God is still worthy of our praise. And so here's the key of the chapter. They cared more about faith than they cared about deliverance. They cared more about faith than they cared about deliverance. And I like the observation that Davis makes. He says, these men give us then a fully balanced picture of faith. And I think that's the right word, a balanced picture. He says, faith knows the power of God. He is able to do this. Faith guards the freedom of God, but if not, and then faith holds the truth of God. We will not serve your gods. And so this is I like that word, a balanced picture of what faith is and what it produces. And so, verse 19, it says, Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury. And so before he had rage and fury, but now verse 19, he's full of fury. And the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And then these men were bound in their coats and their hose and their hats and the other garments, and they were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, it says, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fire furnace. And then, verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and he rose up in haste, and he spake and said unto his counselor, Did not we catch 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered, and they said unto the king, True, O king. And he answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. And then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fire furnace, and he spake, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, for the smell of fire had passed on them. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake, and he said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. And he says, Therefore I make a decree, here's a new decree, that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so, as I said, Nebuchadnezzar was already mad. And now that they have not taken his plea for this kind of second chance, he's now not only mad, he's full of fury. He's beyond her. In fact, verse 19 tells us so mad that his visage was changed. You could see just, if you looked at Nebuchadnezzar, if somebody just walked in the room, had no idea what was happening, he has the strongest men, bind them, cast them into the furnace, which the furnace was so hot, the fire actually killed the men, throwing them into the furnace. And so, again, it's almost like Elijah on Mount Carmel, saying, this challenge isn't hard enough. Just go ahead and soak my whole altar in water, right? God's going to bring the fire, but this is too easy. Let's just go ahead and soak the whole thing in water. And so they make the thing 7 times hotter, hot enough that it kills the ones throwing them in the flame, but not them. And so the 3 said that God would prove himself, that God would deliver us. And God proved himself here as Nebuchadnezzar looks in the furnace. And obviously the famous, most memorable part of the chapter, right, is instead of 3 men, he says, I see 4 walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. And so he recognizes the divine origin of the 4th, and it's so debated. Who is the 4th person in the fire? It's this long, raging debate. And interestingly enough, the only thing we get on the identity of the 4th are the words of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar says in verse, is it 26? Verse 25, the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Widely debated who it was. I think Nebuchadnezzar was right on both fronts, because I think who this was the Old Testament angel of the Lord, is who I believe this is. And I believe that almost every time that phrase is used, it is in reference to a pre-incarnate Christ. And so, again, my opinion on this is that was, in fact, the Son of God walking in the furnace with these other 3 men. And God sent his Son to protect them, divinely protect these men based upon their faith and obedience in him. And the effect this had, and again, this is kind of, I really want everybody to get this tonight. The effect this had was instantaneous. Nebuchadnezzar sees this, obviously is amazed by this. Anybody who saw this would be amazed by this. This is very clearly a miraculous protection, a miraculous deliverance. Not only were they not killed, they weren't hurt. Not a hair on their head was singed. They leave the fiery furnace. They don't even smell like smoke. I mean, this is so bizarre. This is so otherworldly. And instantaneously, Nebuchadnezzar kind of realizes, and I told you in chapter 2, it seemed like Nebuchadnezzar is making steps towards belief. And I think this was another step for Nebuchadnezzar towards belief, wherein we get to the next chapter and see kind of a more full-orbed version of Nebuchadnezzar's belief. But nevertheless, verse 28, he says, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then, in fact, even before he says that, when he calls them out of the furnace, he says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 26, servants of the Most High God, come forth. And so, again, this was an immediate recognition. And I think in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar, he knows, I just asked the question, what God could do this? And these three men, not 20 minutes ago, told me, our God can do this. And here they are, completely fine, totally and divinely protected. So you servants of the Most High God. Now, again, in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, when he says Most High God, more than likely what he means at this point, as I said, I think Nebuchadnezzar becomes a believer, but at this point, I think what he probably means is he's still speaking in a pagan understanding, the Most High, meaning the God of all other gods, right? In the pantheon of gods, the Hebrew God has clearly proven himself to be the best and the highest. He's wrong, obviously, to suggest that there are others, but I do believe that Nebuchadnezzar will get there, and he will see the truth eventually. But he makes a new decree. And this is another kind of clue that he doesn't fully understand God. But it's good intentions. He says that anybody in Babylon who speaks against God should be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after the sword. And why I say this kind of is proof that he still doesn't have the greatest understanding is because this is a very kind of paganistic mindset that I have to protect this God. And that kind of seems like what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. Again, great intentions, good intentions, but I still think evidence that he doesn't fully understand yet. But as a result of their faithfulness, not only are they safe, the end of the chapter shows us that promoted again. They've been safe, they're now promoted. But more importantly, God was recognized and praised even by the pagan people of Babylon. And so that's what we need to take away from this chapter. And so, again, obviously the most memorable part of chapter 3 is the men in the furnace walking around unharmed. That's kind of what sticks with people, and I totally understand that. There's really nothing wrong with that. But what is the chapter teaching us? The most important takeaway from the chapter is not miraculous deliverance. And the reason I say this is because sometimes God delivers and sometimes he doesn't. In other words, we don't come to Daniel chapter 3 and say, anytime you're in any kind of trouble, just have faith because God's going to pull you out of that furnace. I can't say that. God might pull you out of the furnace. He might not pull you out of the furnace. I mean, look at the apostles. Look at how they died. Sometimes God doesn't miraculously deliver. And so the most important takeaway from chapter 3 is not the deliverance, but it's the faithful obedience of the three friends. That's the most important takeaway. And so I'll close by saying this. We should never underestimate the impact that our simple obedience can have, and I will add to that, its ability to become a loving witness to those around us. Because I would submit to you, and again, just kind of my thinking on this, as soon as that decree came down, I don't think that these three men had a plan several steps ahead to say, we're going to abstain from this, he's going to throw us in the fire, God's going to protect us in the fire, and all the people are going to witness that, and they're going to praise God. I think it's pretty unlikely that they had that plan set at the very beginning. No, I think Nebuchadnezzar gave this decree, and in the mind of those three, the only thing they were thinking of is I cannot worship another God. To be obedient to my God, I have to abstain. And then God used their obedience to then be a source of praise and blessing and a loving witness, a loving testimony to everybody else. And so those who were in the room of the Babylonian, pantheon of gods, no, that was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so this is there's a good, very important lesson for us in Daniel chapter 3.